In this country, the fez was banned, the Latin alphabet was adopted, women got the right to vote. We usually date that list to 1 year, 1923. But the very first item on that same list was actually written 134 years earlier. It was the Republic that banned the fez, but the fez was brought in by an entirely different sultan who first tore down the turban and made the fez mandatory. And before that sultan, there was another one who tried to reach the same goal and paid for it with his life, by strangulation. So in this video we're asking, did the Republic really modernize the Ottoman Empire, or was the Republic simply the final act of a process that had already been grinding forward, through blood and stubbornness, for 134 years? To answer that, we're going to follow the story of 3 sultans and 1 edict. First, Selim III, the sultan, who started modernization and lost first his throne, then his life, because of it. Then Mahmud II, the sultan who made the same goal permanent with a far more patient and far bloodier method. Then the Tanzimat Edict, the moment these reforms first became a written law. And at the very end, we'll look at how the Republic inherited this 134-year legacy, what it simply continued, and what it truly reinvented. Ready? We're heading to 1789. Selim III, who took the throne in 1789, didn't grow up in quiet times. He grew up in the middle of a sense of collapse. By the end of the 18th century, the Ottoman army, once a feared power, was losing territory and battle after battle to Russia and Austria. Selim watched this happen firsthand as a young prince. During his years confined to the palace cage, he secretly corresponded with King Louis XVI of France, questioning Europe's armies, its schools, its whole way of producing things. By the time he took the throne, he had one question in mind: how could he make the Ottomans able to stand up to Europe again? In 1792 and 1793, Selim rolled out a reform package he called the Nizam-i Cedid, the New Order. At its heart was a completely new army, trained in the European style, disciplined, and paid on a regular salary. But the military was only the visible part. Tax collection, land tenure, control of the grain trade, all of it was rewritten too. New artillery and gunnery schools opened. Institutions for naval and engineering training were founded. The printing press was revived. Selim also opened the Ottoman Empire's first permanent embassies in European capitals. During this period, he no longer wanted to watch Europe only on the battlefield, but from inside its own capitals. For the first time in Ottoman history, reform wasn't confined to one area. It was a program covering nearly the entire state. But every new order threatens someone who fed off the old one. For the Janissaries, the Nizam-i Cedid wasn't just a military reform, it meant the direct end of their privileged, loosely disciplined position. The stronger the new army grew, the weaker their own reason to exist became. Part of the religious establishment saw these reforms as a drift away from religion and tradition. Growing closeness to France, fueled by the French Revolution, also bred suspicion among conservative circles. As the reform advanced, the alliance against it grew too. The Janissaries and the conservative clergy, two groups that normally kept their distance from each other, united around a common enemy. In 1805, when Balkan provincial lords also objected to stationing Nizam-i Cedid troops in Edirne, the opposition stopped being just a Janissary problem. 2 years later, in 1808, a revolt broke out, led by Mustafa. Selim didn't resist. To avoid bloodshed, he abolished his reforms and was deposed from the throne shortly after. His nephew Mustafa IV, backed by the rebels, took his place. If the story ended here, it could be summed up as the reformist sultan lost his throne. But the real tragedy hadn't happened yet. In the summer of 1808, Alemdar Mustafa Pasha, the provincial lord of Rusçuk, marched on Istanbul to put Selim back on the throne. But by the time Alemdar's troops reached the palace, it was too late. Mustafa IV, to stop Selim from ever returning to power, had already given the order to have his uncle killed. On the 28th of July, 1808, Selim III was strangled to death at the age of 29. That same night, Mustafa ordered the killing of his own brother, Prince Mahmud, the last surviving male heir of the dynasty, who escaped death at the very last moment with the help of his concubines. That same day, Mustafa IV was deposed, and this young prince, who had just returned from the edge of death, took his place, Mahmud II. The moment Alemdar became Grand Vizier, he didn't limit himself to military reform. He summoned the powerful provincial lords of Anatolia and Rumelia to Istanbul and had them sign a document called the Sened-i Ittifak, the Deed of Alliance. It was an oath with no precedent in Ottoman history. The state legally recognized the power the provincial lords had built up on their own, and, in exchange, the Sultan agreed in writing to limit some of his own authority. This document looked like a herald of the Tanzimat that would come 31 years later, but its own life was extremely short. Alemdar Mustafa Pasha, the man who saved Mahmud, got his reward immediately. He became Grand Vizier and wasted no time launching reforms. Alongside the Sened-i Ittifak, he also set up a new army called the Cedid, but his term as Grand Vizier lasted only 3.5 months. On the 15th of November, 1808, the Janissaries rose up again, this time laying siege directly to Alemdar's mansion. When the reinforcements he was waiting for never arrived, Alemdar set his own arsenal on fire rather than surrender. He died there, along with hundreds of rebelling Janissaries. After this second blow, Mahmud was forced to disband the Cedid corps as well. The second man to attempt reform had also been destroyed by the same enemy within a few months. Mahmud II had come to the throne practically over his own corpse, and on top of that, he'd watched the very man who saved him fall to the same enemy. 2 reform attempts, 2 different methods, the same result. As long as the Janissary clergy alliance still stood, no new army was safe. This lesson would shape the next 17 years of his reign. Mahmud would head for the same goal, but this time with a far more patient, far more ruthless method. When Mahmud II took the throne, he didn't attack head-on. For 17 years he waited patiently, consolidated his power, and quietly tallied up which pashas, which clerics stood on his side. During this whole stretch, he didn't even push reform rhetoric out front, because he knew what had brought Selim down wasn't reform itself, but a Janissary clergy alliance still strong enough to resist it. Mahmud didn't change the reform. He changed its timing and the road that led to it. In May of 1825, Mahmud announced he was forming a new military unit called the Eskinci Okagi. It was made up of volunteer soldiers chosen from within the Janissary corps itself. On the surface, it carried no threat at all, and was even presented as an extension of Janissary identity. This was the exact opposite of what Selim had done. He was building the new army from inside, the old one, not outside it. On the 11th of June, 1826, this new unit formally began European-style training. 3 days later, the Janissaries revolted. The Janissaries brought their cauldrons out into Etmedani and launched a revolt, the classic sign of an uprising in Ottoman tradition, and eerily close to the same script as the revolt that had toppled Selim. But this time, Mahmud was ready. He brought the clergy to his side and raised the sacred banner to call the people of Istanbul to fight the Janissaries. He turned cannon fire on their barracks. Over 6,000 Janissaries were killed, and the rest were executed on June 16th and 17th. On the 17th of June, 1826, centuries after its founding, the Janissary corps was formally wiped from history. This event would later be named the Vakai Hairia, the Auspicious Incident. Why did Selim's reform fail while Mahmud's became permanent? The difference is simple, but crucial. Selim tried to keep the Janissaries and the new army standing side by side. Both existed at once, and a clash became inevitable. Mahmud, at the end of 17 years of preparation, erased the Janissaries entirely. There was no old order left to fall back on, not even physically. The single biggest military-political obstacle to modernization was wiped from history in a single day, and the sultan who did it had lived through, in his own flesh, exactly how that same obstacle had once destroyed another sultan. Mahmud didn't stop at destroying their military power. That same year, he also shut down the lodges of the Bektashi order, whose spiritual and material roots were deeply entangled with the Janissaries, and formally banned the order. Even if you break the sword, the order's spiritual network could survive. Mahmud closed off that possibility too. Abolishing the Janissary corps was only the beginning. On the 3rd of March, 1829, his dress code law stripped officials of the turban and robe and made the fez, trousers, and jacket mandatory today. When we picture old Ottoman, the fez is actually what comes to mind. But it was a new addition Mahmud brought in himself, tearing down one old symbol only to impose another. In 1831, he launched the Ottoman Empire's first official newspaper under the name Takvimi Vakai, and that same year he had the empire's first census taken, a census that only counted men, since its real purpose was figuring out how many could be conscripted. In 1834 he opened the first postal route, from Üsküdar to Izmit. Within a single human lifetime, the state had turned an appearance that had barely changed in 300 years into something unrecognizable. Building a new army wasn't enough. That army also needed officers, surgeons, engineers trained to European standards. On the 14th of March, 1827, Mahmud founded the Tifane Amaya to train Muslim physicians and surgeons. In 1834, the Mektebi Harbiye opened to supply officers for the Asakiri Mansoure Muhammediye. After these schools, students began, for the first time, being sent to Europe for education in a systematic way. Mahmud wasn't just changing the soldier's uniform, he was changing the very source of the knowledge that trained that soldier. Just a year before his death, on the 24th of March 1838, Mahmud founded one more institution, the Meclisi Valai Ahkami Adliye. This High Council, similar to today's Court of Cassation and Council of State, heard legal disputes, tried senior bureaucrats, and planned civil and financial reforms. When his son Abdulmesid proclaimed the Tanzimat a year later, the institution needed to carry out those principles was already in place. Mahmud had built the administrative skeleton for the edict his son would sign before he himself died. Mahmud had changed the army, changed the clothing, changed communication, changed education. He'd even built the bureaucratic institution to carry reforms forward. But one thing he hadn't changed yet. An ordinary Ottoman subject still had no written guarantee, under the law, against the Sultan's arbitrary decisions. Reform still lived between the Sultan's own two lips. A right granted today could be taken back tomorrow just as easily. This step would be taken in 1839, just weeks after Mahmud's death, by his son Abdulmesid, and not out of pure voluntary idealism, but in the middle of the state's own existential crisis. The Tanzimat wasn't born in a vacuum. On the 24th of June, 1839, the armies of Mehmed Ali Pasha, governor of Egypt, dealt the Ottoman army a crushing defeat at Nizam. Just days before this news reached Istanbul, Mahmud II had already died, the 16-year-old Abdulmesid taking the throne. Inherited both his father's death and perhaps the empire's most dangerous military crisis at the very same moment. Winning European support, England's, above all, was now a matter of survival. The equality promised to non-Muslim subjects in the Tanzimat Edict wasn't just domestic reform, it was also a letter of assurance addressed to Europe. On the 3rd of November, 1839, in front of a crowd gathered at Gulhane Park, Foreign Minister Mustafa Reshid Pasha read out an edict in a loud voice. The young Sultan Abdulmesid, just 16 years old and only a few months into his reign, swore to abide by the articles that were read. This edict went down in history as the Tanzimat Edict, or after the place it was read, the Gulhane Hati Humayunu, the noble rescript of the Rose Chamber. The edict revolved around 6 main headings, but its essence can be summed up in one sentence. No one would be punished without trial, courts would be open, everyone, regardless of religion or nationality, would be equal before the law, and taxes would be collected through set procedures, not on a whim. This was the first time in Ottoman history that a sultan had limited his own absolute authority in writing. The steps Mahmud took with the fez, the newspaper, the census were visible, but they could be taken back. The Tanzimat, for the first time, tied those steps down with a written guarantee. The Tanzimat wasn't a one-off event, it became a beginning. In 1856, the Reform Edict expanded the reforms further. In 1876, and again in 1908, constitutional monarchy was declared, letting an Ottoman parliament convene for the first time, and a constitution take effect for the first time. Not every step was flawless, not every reform was fully carried out, and there were steps backward too, but the line is clear. From 1789 onward, the Ottoman state was living under a continuous pressure to modernize. By the time the Republic was founded, that line was already 134 years old. If modernization really has been going on since 1789, why does this story start in almost everyone's mind in 1923? Part of the answer is simple. The Republic's reforms were far more striking. Visually, the alphabet changing overnight, everyone putting on hats, women going to the ballot box, all happening within a single generation's view, and all documented in photographs. Selim's or Mahmud's reforms, on the other hand, unfolded far more slowly and far more unevenly, a process squeezed across decades, wedged between a lost war, a revolt, an assassination, and every newly founded state also wants to tell its own founding story as a clean 0 point that's not a tendency unique to Turkey. This video's goal isn't to erase that story, but to show what came before it. When the Republic was proclaimed on the 29th of October 1923, Mustafa Kemal wasn't facing a blank page. The fez had already arrived once, through reform. The official newspaper had already existed for 92 years. The idea of equality before the law had already been debated for 84 years. The idea of a parliament had already been tried twice. What the Republic inherited was a modernization project that was unfinished, but whose direction had long since been set, a project Selim had started, Mahmud had made permanent in blood, and the Tanzimat had put into writing. But it would also be unfair to reduce the Republic to just a continuation of the Ottomans, because some of its steps really were new and far more radical. On the 25th of November 1925, the Hat Law was passed, and this time the fez itself joined the list of banned items. On the 4th of October 1926, the Turkish Civil Code took effect, putting family law, marriage, divorce, inheritance on an entirely secular footing. In 1928, the switch to the Latin alphabet abandoned centuries of Arabic script writing. This was a transition from a world where even Mahmud's Takvimi Vekai was only accessible to those who could already read and write, to an entirely different world where millions of people learned to read and write in a new alphabet within just a few years. On the 5th of December 1934, women were granted the right to vote and stand for office earlier, in fact, than many European countries of the time. None of these had a direct counterpart under Ottoman rule. These truly belonged to the Republic alone. The law on unification of education, passed on the 3rd of March 1924, brought every school in the country, including the religious madrasas, under a single roof, the Ministry of National Education. Religious and secular education, which had stood side by side for centuries under the Ottomans, merged into a single system for the first time. The principle of secularism, meanwhile, didn't settle in all at once, but gradually it was formally written into the constitution in 1937. This was a very different method from Mahmud simply mandating the fez with a single law. The Republic was rebuilding the institutions themselves, not just changing their appearance. On the 30th of November 1925, Parliament passed a law closing the Sufi lodges and shrines and banning the use of titles like Sheikh and Dervish. This law had nothing directly to do with the Janissaries. It gained momentum from the Sheikh Said rebellion, but it carried a familiar echo. Exactly 100 years earlier, in 1826, Mahmud II had shut down the Bektashi lodges with a similar logic, because a religious order's institutional network could turn into a shelter for political opposition. 2 different centuries, 2 different rulers, one a sultan, one a parliament, repeating the very same instinct of the state. No reform was ever considered permanent until the institutional networks capable of resisting modernization had been dismantled. There are 2 ways to see this. The first says, the Republic didn't start modernization, it was simply the last and fastest link in a chain that had been running since Selim. The Fez, the official newspaper, equality before the law, even the idea of a parliament, all of it already existed. The Republic's real achievement wasn't inventing, but completing. In this view, leaving Selim and Mahmud out of the story was a deliberate choice, made to present the Republic's founding myth as cleaner and more from scratch. The second says, it's a mistake to overstate that line, because the Republic did, in 11 years, what the Ottomans had failed to do in 134, changing the alphabet, fully secularizing family law, granting women's rights. Changes this deep had never been attempted at this speed in any period of Ottoman rule, and couldn't have been. In this view, the real difference isn't quantity but quality. Selim and Mahmud changed the state's appearance, while the Republic rebuilt society itself, the family structure, the education system, the position of women. Both are looking at the same history and drawing a different conclusion, and both, on their own terms, are defensible. So, did modernization start with the Republic? No. It started 134 years before the Republic was founded, in 1789, with Selim III, and it cost Selim his life. 10 years later, in 1808, Alemdar Mustafa Pasha marched toward the same goal once more, and he too lost his life. The Sened-i Ittifak was buried along with him. In 1826, in the hands of Mahmud II, a man who had personally lived through exactly what had happened to Selim and to Alemdar, it became irreversible. In 1839, with the Tanzimat, it became written law for the first time. At every single step, the same nameless opposition was waiting, and at every step, someone paid for it with their life. Selim, Alemdar, thousands of Janissaries, countless people whose names we'll never know. The Republic didn't deny this inheritance, it took it up and accelerated it with its own radical additions. This isn't a contest of who did more. This is the story of a 134-year, unbroken and often bloody process, and maybe its final page still hasn't been written, even now, in 1923. So, do you think these 3 names, Selim, Mahmud, and Mustafa Kemal, are links in the same chain, or 3 separate, disconnected stories? Let's discuss it in the comments. More videos on the Ottoman Empire's lesser-known reformers are coming. Subscribe so you don't miss them.